Most military histories treat cold as, well, just background scenery. Snow becomes atmosphere. Winter becomes a dramatic setting for campaigns that ultimately hinge on leadership, logistics, and firepower. But when you read the journals of soldiers and trappers who actually slept on frozen ground, you begin to understand that cold was not scenery. It was a weapon. It disabled hands before rifles could be fired. It clouded judgment. It killed quietly at night, long after the day's fighting had ended. What often goes unexamined is how indigenous knowledge systems had already solved many of these problems centuries before modern armies relearned them at great cost. Among the most effective solutions was something deceptively simple, a fur bedding system often described by traders and soldiers as a hunter's cocoon. It was not a tent, it was not merely a blanket, it was a portable microclimate, engineered through accumulated environmental knowledge, designed to preserve heat in conditions that regularly dropped below zero. Understanding this system forces us to reconsider how survival knowledge travels, and how often modern institutions ignored the people who understood the land best. To understand why the hunter's cocoon mattered, we need to look at how armies historically misunderstood cold. European military doctrine developed in relatively temperate climates. Even campaigns in Eastern Europe during the early modern period did not initially produce standardized cold weather systems. Bedding was heavy, often wool-based, and dependent on supply trains. Armies assumed they would winter in quarters. When that assumption failed, cold became catastrophic. The French invasion of Russia in 1812 remains the most famous example. Yet what's less discussed is that Russian peasants and indigenous Siberian groups possessed layered fur systems that allowed extended survival outdoors. French troops, by contrast, lacked appropriate bedding and shelter. Frostbite and hypothermia were not incidental. They were structurally built into the army's lack of environmental adaptation. This pattern repeated itself in North America. Early colonial forces, routinely suffered through winters that indigenous hunters navigated with relative efficiency. The difference really wasn't toughness, it was systems, clothing systems, shelter systems, sleep systems. And sleep, more than most military historians actually acknowledge, determines combat effectiveness. Indigenous bedding systems were built around insulation, compression control, and moisture management. Across subarctic and plains cultures, hunters developed fur robes and enclosed bedding rolls constructed from caribou, bison, deer, or smaller fur bearers, depending on the region. Caribou hide, in particular, is an exceptional insulator because, each hair is hollow. That structure traps air, and trapped air is what holds heat. The cocoon concept involved wrapping the sleeper in multiple fur layers, hair side, inward or outward depending on moisture conditions. In some traditions, hides were sewn into envelope-like forms that enclosed the body with minimal air gaps. The goal was not simply warmth, it was controlled warmth. Too much compression reduces insulation. Too much open space, on the other hand, invites convection currents that pull heat away. Equally important was separation from the ground. Indigenous sleepers understood that conduction into frozen earth would drain body heat faster than ambient air. Spruce boughs, bark, or layered hides created a thermal break. The system was modular, repairable, and adapted to available materials. This was not primitive improvisation. It was environmental engineering shaped by centuries of trial, failure, and refinement. The fur trade became one of the first channels through which European settlers began to adopt this knowledge. By the 17th and 18th centuries, French voyageurs and British traders operating deep in North America learned quickly that wool blankets alone were insufficient for extended winter travel. Many adopted indigenous-style bedding rolls and clothing combinations. Written accounts describe traders preferring caribou skin sleeping systems over imported materials. Yet institutional militaries were slower to adapt. Individual frontiersmen learned from indigenous communities because survival demanded it. Armies, constrained by uniformity and supply doctrine, resisted localized adaptation. During the 7 Years' War in North America, British regulars often suffered in winter campaigns where indigenous allies operated more effectively. Rangers and irregular units who integrated indigenous methods like lighter loads, fur-based insulation, and flexible bedding fared better. These lessons influenced the later development of Ranger doctrine and frontier warfare training, but they rarely translated into broader European military practice. The American Civil War offers another overlooked example of environmental learning. Though not primarily remembered as a winter war, many campaigns involved prolonged exposure to cold conditions. Union and Confederate soldiers relied heavily on wool blankets and tentage. Indigenous-style fur bedding was not widely adopted, partly due to supply constraints and partly due to cultural distance from indigenous technologies. By contrast, Plains tribes during the same period maintained highly effective winter survival systems built around the bison robe. A well-prepared buffalo robe could serve as bedding, cloak, and shelter component. Soldiers who acquired such robes prized them, but honestly, large-scale procurement never became systematic. The lesson was clear but unheeded. Industrial supply chains did not automatically outperform localized environmental knowledge. The 20th century forced modern militaries to relearn this reality at scale. During the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, Finnish forces demonstrated extraordinary winter mobility against Soviet troops. While not indigenous in the North American sense, Finnish practices reflected similar principles: layered insulation, ground separation, and compact sleep systems that preserved body heat without excessive weight. Soviet troops initially suffered from inadequate clothing and bedding distribution. Cold injuries mounted rapidly. Over time, the Red Army, adapted with better insulated gear and a more deliberate cold weather doctrine. But adaptation, it often followed loss. In North America, indigenous knowledge influenced both civilian and military cold weather equipment development, though this happened more quietly. Arctic exploration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries revealed that European wool-based systems just failed in extreme cold, especially when moisture built up. Explorers who actually adopted Inuit fur clothing and bedding practices survived at higher rates than those who insisted on imported methods. The United States military's later development of modular sleep systems, layered bags, vapor barriers, insulating ground pads, really reflects principles that have been embedded in indigenous practice for a very long time. Control moisture, trap air, prevent ground conduction, and avoid compressing insulation. What the hunter's cocoon embodied was not just warmth, but, honestly, energy conservation. In freezing environments, calories become fuel for survival. If the body expends too much energy overnight just to maintain core temperature, cognitive performance, it declines the next day. Decision-making degrades. Reaction time slows. In warfare, that margin matters a lot. Indigenous hunters operating in sub-zero environments simply could not afford nightly energy deficits. The cocoon system minimized heat loss so that metabolic reserves were preserved. This translated into endurance, days and weeks of sustained function without catastrophic fatigue. Modern military sleep research now confirms what these systems implied: uninterrupted, thermally stable sleep is a force multiplier. Armies invest heavily in sleep management because, cognitive clarity under stress really determines outcomes. The historical record suggests that indigenous bedding systems solved part of this equation centuries ago. There's also a cultural lesson embedded in this history. European observers often described indigenous technologies as simple, yet simplicity in appearance masked complexity in design logic. The hunter's cocoon required knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal hide preparation, sewing techniques, airflow control, and terrain selection. It represented integration of ecology, craftsmanship, and lived experience. When institutions dismissed such systems as primitive, they did so at their own peril. The cost was measured in frostbite cases, lost mobility, and diminished operational effectiveness. For modern survivalists and preparedness-minded viewers, the lesson is not to romanticize the past, but to analyze it honestly. Technology does not replace fundamentals. Synthetic insulation may outperform fur in certain metrics, but the principles remain identical. Insulation requires loft. Moisture destroys loft. Ground contact, well, that just drains heat. Modularity increases resilience. Repairability, honestly, matters more than theoretical performance ratings. The hunter's cocoon was durable, field-serviceable, and adapted to local resources. In a disrupted supply environment, those qualities really do matter. It also underscores a broader historical pattern. Environments shape doctrine more than ideology does. Armies that ignore terrain and climate lose. Communities that integrate environmental knowledge endure. And, remembering the hunter's cocoon means recognizing that survival knowledge is often decentralized, accumulated outside formal institutions, and transmitted through lived practice rather than manuals. Cold remains one of the oldest adversaries in human history. It has halted invasions, reshaped borders, and erased armies without firing a shot. Yet it has also been negotiated successfully by those who treated it not as scenery, but as a condition to be engineered around. The indigenous bedding systems of North America were part of that engineering tradition. They remind us that survival is rarely about brute endurance. It is about design, adaptation, and respect for environment. If you value examining the overlooked mechanisms behind historical success and failure, if you believe that small, practical systems often determine large outcomes, subscribe to the Prepper Historian and share this video. These are the details that reshape how we understand the past and how we prepare for the future.